Thank you, one and all, for settling into our session together. I'm happy to be here, and one thing I never did when I was a professor was shush the class. It is the single most effective way, however, but I always made a student do it rather than do it myself. I saw too many mean faces look back at me when I shushed the class, understandably. Thank you so much for lingering with us in this session. We will talk more about solidarity, in particular from the lens of experience and how we partner with others. I've invited a number of guests, one of whom had to back away. One of my colleagues in Providence St. Joseph Health, Jennifer Donatov, who is the regional ethicist for Southern California, lives just down the road toward LA, but she was unable to join us after all. My other colleagues on the panel, I will introduce one at a time. We'll go in the following order. Rick Rawson will lead us out. J.C. Belliard will follow Rick, and then I'll follow them. And we'll have time for questions immediately after each talk, but then also after all three of us. So please take the time to jot down whatever questions and thoughts you might have as you engage. So let me just share briefly. Rick Rawson is someone that I met through Francisco, a friend of Andy and I's, a former student of Francisco Cross. And Francisco, during the pandemic, wanted to have a session, and Rick was the CEO of the hospital. Which hospital? In Rideout. Yeah, north of Sacramento. And so Andy and I participated. We had a lovely session. I think it was primarily about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly with regard to the pandemic and the disparities we were seeing in the early stages of the pandemic. So I had come to know Rick slightly before that through Dora Barilla, who is a colleague of his at Healthy Connected Communities, or HC2 Strategies. Dora Barilla was a longtime student and employee of Loma Linda, and years ago she was in a course, Ethical Issues in Public Health. And then she was later a colleague of mine at Providence St. Joseph Health. And together with Rick, they have formed this HC2 Strategies Incorporated, and have done a lot of work. How long has it been going now? 8 years. And so much has been done. He is an assistant clinical professor and executive in residence for the Loma Linda University School of Public Health. He holds an associate certified coach credential with the International Coaching Federation. He's been over 39 years as a mission-driven leader in healthcare, and he's known as an innovator and strategist who has inspired transformation and performance of out-of-the-box sorts of innovation in his time in the industry. An MBA here at Loma Linda, MBA at Bakersfield. Is that right? Cal State University. And then a BA in Business Administration and Management. Thank you, Rick, for joining us. And I had no idea I was asking him to join us, thinking he was living in California. He lives in Massachusetts now. And and so we're really grateful that you were willing to join us, Rick. Thank you. The podium is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, if it's okay, I'll just speak from here. But to this month, it's been 40 years since I graduated from Loma Linda University and started my career in healthcare administration. And as I was driving here today, I was at the La Sierra campus, which at the time, back in the olden days, was part of Loma Linda University. That's what my diploma says. But I was watching all the students streaming across the campus. And I started thinking to myself, seeing their enthusiasm, their hopes, their aspirations, what system are we inviting them into? What are they going to find when they embark with their idealism, the reasons, the dreams that they have when they get their first job? And I think it's on us as leaders to think very seriously around what we do to design and create systems that aren't going to end up in disappointment and burnout like many in my generation, but really will help people live in to the purpose of why they decided to get into healthcare in the first place. So I'm going to start out with a comment. Healthcare is in crisis. I've heard that for 40 years. Every year it's this or that, it's the sky is going to fall, but healthcare is in crisis. Health systems across the country are showing significant financial losses, things we wouldn't have even believed 10 years ago, in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. These are the systems that have grown exponentially, who believe that they had to consolidate, driven much, in my opinion, by fear of big system changes. They needed to be too big to fail. We learned that in 2008. But as we got bigger and bigger, I think we began to become disconnected from the soul and the people that we served. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about, because as we talk about solidarity, how do we look at solidarity as a pathway to healing our healthcare organizations and our healthcare systems? Because I believe at its core, a financial crisis is simply a symptom of a deeper spiritual crisis. In my experience, the largest financial turnarounds I have seen, that I have had the opportunity to be experienced with, have not been clever business strategies. They haven't been cutting FTEs. It's been about diving deep into what mission means. They felt much more like a spiritual revival, and in some cases an exorcism, than they did a business strategy. And that has influenced the way I think about it. So when I see a financial crisis, I'm like, that all that is a symptom of a deeper spiritual breakdown somewhere in the organization. And so I want to talk a little bit about why that happens and how that happens, and how we can think of how we stand in solidarity with our communities, with the people who live in our communities, our patients, and especially our employees, to think differently about how we begin to heal ourselves, to live in to the dream and the aspiration of what our calling and our mission in Adventist healthcare is. So how do we respond to these crises? What do we really believe? And will we choose to use these crises as an inflection point for transformation, or just adapt one more time to a system out of our control and continue to be agents of perpetuating a broken system? I think that is a question ahead of us. And I very much appreciated your question earlier around that, because I have railed against the comment, no mission, no margin. And I'm just going to start with that because I wanted to stand up and address that. because I believe that comment is a rationalization of our abdication of responsibility to put mission at the core and center of who we are and define our business around that. And I think oftentimes we rationalize, well, we'd like to do that, but we can't because of all these realities in which we live. And that's been my experience. And I've heard that more times than I can count. And as I look back at it, what actions does it create? What decisions does it put us into making that become different than what our core? And I want to finish this with ethics, because I think ethics become a very important part of finding the courage to do something different. I want to look at this from a strategic perspective. I am a strategist. I want to look at it as from an organizational perspective, and briefly at a community perspective, because I know JC's going to talk a lot more about that. But I spent a lot of time reflecting about solidarity. You know, to me, solidarity means standing with, and I love the previous presentation. It was very, very powerful. But there's another implication, and that's what do we stand against? You know, yes, we stand with, but what are we arrayed? What do we stand against? And so who do we stand with? What do we stand with? Do we stand with our system and the industry? Do we become apologists for the way things are and just try to put good words and platitudes around how we do a little bit better than others that are providing similar services? Or are we in a fundamentally different business, even though it looks like we do the same things, because we're being driven by something much deeper in our soul? Who are the people we're standing with? Do we stand with other people and organizations who are working for similar impact? Can we divorce ourselves of this idea of competition and scarce resources to look at how do we have scale to collaborate and make a difference in the world? When I worked here at Loma Linda, especially when I was in this room, and I looked out that window, and I knew that a mile that direction and a mile that direction, we have made very little impact. Now, hopefully that's improving, but we live in a suffering community, and we want to impact the world. But how do we scale? How do we stand in relationship with everybody in this community that is a bonding relationship versus a transactional one that we're happy to serve you when you come to us or when you need us or when you can find your way to us? But how do we live every day of our lives and your lives together? And I think to me, that's a much more interesting strategic question. And what kind of things do we do that are transformative to the business that we do as we try to answer that question? Are we standing with our neighbors, our community members, our patients? Or are we just serving them? Are we just providing the expertise we have to help them through their period of crisis? How many staff in our emergency rooms are burning out because these people who have tremendous needs keep coming, and the next week they're back, and the next week they're back, and they keep getting worse even though we're providing the best that healthcare has to offer? How can we give our staff something more to know they're making a difference in that time that they spend on the front lines dealing with acute care? How do we stand in solidarity with our workforce and our employees? Do we see our workforce as value creators, or do we see them as a cost and a liability? What happens when we face financial challenges? Do we look to them as a solution, or do we look to them as a barrier as to what we're trying to accomplish financially? And so these are questions I find very interesting. And do we stand with the value of the human being, or do we stand with the value of the transactions that we define our business as. So what do we stand against? Do we stand against the conventional wisdoms and industry norms based on competition? So why does the community want to see competition? Because we've lost trust. They believe that if we don't have competition, that's the only thing that will keep us responsible, to not gouge them, to not take advantage of them. And so competition becomes a proxy for a breakdown in trust in our system. Do we live in a world of scarcity? There's never enough reimbursement. We have financial problems because we're not getting paid enough. Yet we live in one of the richest countries in the world. Yet you can drive down almost through any city right now and see major tragedies of misallocation of wealth and injustice that's taking place, that's becoming a liability for our entire society. How do we, in what we stand for and who we stand with, make a difference in that? Are we standing against the business and industrial models that are built on extraction of value? Or are we standing against these things that we accept as the way the system works? Do we let capital markets define who we are and what we do? I wish I could count all the times that I've heard that, oh, we have to do this because our bond rating. But that's the system in which we live, and it's a multi-layered system, and there's many forces that pull us into compliance with that continues to perpetuate it. But from the last presentation I heard, we are standing in a revolutionary place when we stand in solidarity. And so how do we become agents of change around that? I thought it was a very interesting discussion around, is the environment, fixed, or do we have agency in that environment? And as a strategist, I've always felt that the way we do strategy sells out our ability to change the environment. It creates small thinking because we accept these forces that, frankly, focused strategy could begin to change. A focused effort, a focused change of how we think about value. What are our hierarchies of model? Do we stand against the expert model, of which has paid us handsomely for the work that we do, but has systematically disempowered people from their own health? When I see physicians that I've worked with burning out, it's because they're doing everything they can to help people, but for the way the system works, their patients don't have that sense of responsibility. But the dependency that we've created in the system has continued to feed that. And so it's served us well. And when you see organizations that have tried to break this down and have tried to stand with and in collaboration, and the Camden Coalition in Camden, New Jersey is a good example of this. They had huge turnover of their healthcare professionals because the idea of being with and being in suffering with people as a way to build relationship and trust was more than they could take, and giving away the power that their profession had bestowed on them. And so you can see how these forces conspire to continue to perpetuate and recreate the system we work in. Do we stand against equity and privilege, or inequities and privilege that have become so rampant? Are they problems too big for us to solve? And so again, we try to find ways to make things look good, but what are we doing to change that? And, do we stand against a leadership philosophy that sees staff as resources to be extracted instead of solutions to create value for the organization? We have two levels of thinking about organizations. Some see that an organization is a cumulative value of the individuals who work in it. And some believe that a person has value because they work in the organization that confers its value on them. It sounds like words and semantics, but it takes you in two completely different directions of what you believe about people and what you believe their capacity is to find the solutions to what seem like unanswerable questions. You can get 20 smart people in a boardroom and they can be the 20 smartest people in your organization, but they're bottlenecked by their capacity to be in a relationship and to understand and to live with the people that they lead. Transformational leadership is how do you unleash the thousands of people and the capacity they have for value creation in an organization. Why doesn't that happen? Because it's scary. Why is control important to us? We lose control. Why is control important? Well, control is important because we've lost our ability to trust. And we've lost our ability to trust because we've lost our ability to live in relationship. And so what does control become? It becomes a proxy of that breakdown in trust. So how do we move beyond that and begin healing those relationships? How do we stand in solidarity where trust becomes the currency on which we build our organizations and we build our strategies? I want to speak briefly about the community level, because how do we see a community as a set of gifts to be realized versus problems to be solved? Peter Block wrote a book called Community several years ago and said the only thing that will solve problems in the communities are the gifts of the people who live in the communities themselves. And so as leaders, what are we doing to empower that to happen versus coming in with our outside expertise and our better ideas to tell people how to live versus learn from them of how we should be living? So I want to close on talking a little bit about ethics, because to me, ethics is finding the courage to be different. Many accept the conventional thinking as the reality in which we work, the tough reality, the hard decisions. But by putting it into an ethical framework, we can begin getting past that. I've heard a lot of conversations among executive peers when it comes to cutting costs, that you can't cut your way to greatness. I'd like to count that as many times as I've heard no mission, no margin. But you can't cut your way to greatness becomes the prelude to cutting your way to lack of greatness. Cutting out your creation of value versus, and whose fault is it? Who hired these people? Who made the decision to create these structures and departments? And why aren't they creating the value that they were designed to create? Where does that responsibility lie? And I would argue that that is an accountability and responsibility that ourselves as healthcare leaders need to deeply reflect on. And maybe the solution is going back to why we did it in the first place and doubling down on why and how we create value in the world. We say we don't have a choice, but we always have a choice. And so the ethical frameworks can provide the courage to counter these incredibly powerful forces that influence our decisions, our choices, and influence what we believe is possible. Because putting this in a framework of ethics puts it in the framework of personal and organizational integrity. If it's just a choice of bad options, we can rationalize doing a lot of damage. But when we cross that red line of our ethical frameworks, we begin to find inside of us a source of courage to stand against these forces that are arrayed to reinforce these systems of inequity. It taps into our consistent and deeply held beliefs We know what we cannot afford to compromise, because we begin to rot away when we start compromising our ethical frameworks. And the question then is, do we perpetuate the current situation by our choices, or do we choose to transform ourselves, our organizations, and our communities? The great irony in healthcare is that when we lean into this and open ourselves up to stand in solidarity with others, as we look to do the healing ministry of Jesus Christ, we ourselves become healed.
Nice. Thank you very much, Rick. Thank you. I will serve as the microphone distributor. If there's ever anything you've ever wanted to ask a hospital executive, now this is your opportunity. And he's retired, so he can speak as freely as he wishes. Questions? Yes, coming to you.
Thank you. Just more of a reflection on what you've said. I enjoyed what you've said. To defend the phrase "no margin, no mission," that's, to me, it's the other way around. It doesn't have to be financial. When we don't have anything, we cannot give anything. So margin can be not necessarily a financial aspect. And another thought that I wanted to share is that when changing the communities or investing in changing the system, how do we take part in that? Look at what would Jesus do? And he was all about discipleship. He was investing in the individuals, creating disciples. He did not try to change the system. In fact, many times he said, poor will always be with us. I am with you only for a time being. So how do you add that into the context you've shared?
Thank you. I think as we live into relationship and communities, discipleship is finding that humility. They mentioned earlier about Jim Collins' work and the idea of level 5 leadership and servant leadership. And I think as leaders, we have to realize that we are also growing and learning as disciples, right? And I think when we believe in the value of others, that they have something to teach us, that they have something to learn, then we begin to empower and unleash the value in them. So I think in solidarity, there's power. There's power around what matters in the community versus how value is created. It creates a new dynamic of value. And I've been very interested in the idea of value, because historical economists have passed down to us a philosophy of value. And there's been some really interesting work recently by Maria Mazzucato from the London School of Economics, who's really questioned the whole foundation of how we determine and look at value. And I found this interesting because I came to believe that the value in an organization was really the value of the people. And so leadership began, how do we find the wisdom in the people? How do we learn what they have to teach and what the passion is that they bring? And that strategy becomes really about the collective and how do you align that versus control that? Because the control is what disempowers. The alignment is what empowers. And when you empower 2,000, 3,000, 20,000 people, the exponential value of what's created based on what God put in each individual becomes far surpasses the ability of any organization with the way we structure hierarchies to be successful, in my opinion.
So thank you. I work for the 1,000-pound gorilla in our community who sucks up all the oxygen and claims all the space. And sometimes that's what our health systems are. We want a helicopter and a solution before they've identified what the problem is. And then when it doesn't work, we want to instrumentalize them to make it work. And then they resent us, don't want to work with us anymore. And I feel that, health systems are about trying to solve problems, and poverty is too big a problem. Or else it's about trying to buy a solution, and we haven't got enough money to end poverty. So we don't know what to do. So we stay away from it. We play at the fringes of it. How to be a community actor is a foreign thing to us, because, we don't have to be the playwright. We don't have to be the director. We don't even have to be the lead actor, but often there is a role that we can play. And when you look at the advisory board, they wrote the 4 roles for a health system can play is as a specialist. So if you're cardiac and you're doing something in the community around cardiac prevention, or as a sponsor, and a sponsor is what we do most. We sprinkle a little bit of money around here and there. I'm not sure whether it's for community impact or marketing. And then, the third role we can play is as a convener, where we bring people together. Because the reality is, what I see in my community, so in Dayton, it's the 4th highest levels of poverty in the US and the 2nd worst opioid crisis. And there's a lot of activity in the community, but there's no common strategy in the community. And how do we become the convener around bringing people around together to take that activity and lead to common strategy, which leads to impact? And then, or else we can take a specific issue and be the hub, but where there's many spokes, but we help to bring it together. And I feel that we have not really looked broadly across those things. And the reality is that's not about money. We have a tremendous amount of resource of intelligent people who can contribute in many ways beyond just giving money. And how do you build that relationship within the community, that you are a resource to the community rather than the community is a resource to you? And I'm not trying to sort of make this about me, but, the reality is my background is in public health, community development, ADRA at a global level, ADRA at a national level in Australia. And I found just working amongst the community that I'd say the last half a dozen conversations I've had have never been about asking me for sponsorship. But new people in town say, come to Kettering, get how they'll connect you. And how do we play more of that role of doing that? Because I think we sit back and say, we're always fighting about the budget because we're trying to make it about money. But the reality is, I can tell you globally, money has never solved poverty yet, no matter how much money we spend on it. So how do we actually as a system truly engage in that community as a community actor in a transformational way? And that's more about intentionality than it is about money. And thank you for bringing those points forward. And I'm sorry just to be summarizing what you said.
Yeah, could I respond to that? Because that was beautifully put, because I think this is really the new frontier of healthcare system strategy. It's how do you live in relationship with your community? How do you become the trusted partner? We've done what we're good at, and we maintain the quality of what we do by the control that we put into it. And right now, what the work that we do in our company is we're doing facilitation in the state of California in 21 counties around what the state's ambition is to roll out CalAIM, which is providing social investments into communities to provide what would have traditionally been social services. So housing services, recuperative care, enhanced care management for marginal populations, things like that. And this work cannot be done by any one player. It's work that has to be facilitated between counties, public health systems, and community-based organizations. Well, they've not used to working together. And trying to get health systems engaged in these conversations that they don't control is scary to them, because we institutionally are a little bit addicted to control. And, So now we have to be in space where we are just one person at a table. But what we have that the rest of them don't is the capacity and the expertise and some resources to be able to be a catalyst for bringing an entire community together. But it's laying our resources on the table for common use. And that's where it gets really scary. It's letting that go and letting the community begin to own the resources that they've given us over the years. So this idea of ethical solidarity is really central, I think, to where our future is and living into the possibility that we have as health systems. But it's not doing it. It's not, there isn't enough money. I mean, we have enough of our own transactional problems. But by being present and by being there as part of that, it's amazing what that will enliven. And with the gifts of all the other organizations that have been doing this work for years, just underappreciated, underfunded, unsupported, and disconnected. So there's power in connection, because in a way, that's what solidarity is. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I was curious. I think one of the things I hear whenever it gets mentioned to get engaged out in the community, go beyond the four walls of the hospital and address some of these societal issues, there's always a concern or even a fear of then being held accountable. And that's the reason why we should tread lightly and not overextend. So just wondering if you've encountered that and how you sort of maybe change that mindset in your career, or help people overcome that fear. And then secondly, what role or how important is it for us to step back and look at the financial reimbursement model as a whole in this country, and advocating for it to change to support this kind of work? Just kind of how that fits into things.
So I think an accountable organization craves accountability. I don't think accountability is something to be feared, but something to be leaned into. And so how do we create collective accountability in a community? Because in essence, that's what empowerment is. You're giving responsibility and collective accountability around how are we addressing these very complex problems in our community. And so I think again, this comes back to, do we control it, and are we going to get blamed for it? But blame is a very different idea than accountability. I think if we don't try to control it, but we are there with everyone at the table, I think it gets us past that issue.
Okay, we have two more questions, and then we'll slide into JC's talk. So let's be judicious with our time.
Judicially speaking, you spoke of the young people crossing the campus and what kind of system we're inviting them to. I recently had coffee with a young person like that who's working on an MBA and is excited about a career in Adventist healthcare. He said to me, I asked the hospital president, what is the unique value proposition of Adventist healthcare? His response was, we pray before meetings. Now, we first heard the term religious arrogance back in the 80s from a lawyer who was trying to piece together the crisis we had in Adventist healthcare then. Religious arrogance. How can we lead? How can you lead us with the tremendous talk you've given today? How can we be community partners, effective community partners, when we come to the table with the religious arrogance of the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
Thank you.
We can't. We have to lose religious arrogance, and we have a lot to learn. In the organization I worked in for many years, mission was more about culture than it was about purpose for many, many years. So our mission talks were about history, where we came from, what we did, and then what we served in the cafeteria? Or do we pray before meetings? But I think what I've learned over time is the mission is how we live into relationship with others. It is really truly being a relational model and trying to understand how that transforms our business, not puts window dressing on the system.
I have a question too. My name is Gudrun Klim. Even the motto of Loma Linda is to make man whole. What about community? Because what about Ubuntu? What about the sense of serving us? We always have here in the health system an individualized approach. We don't address really as Adventist health system poverty, drug use, readmissions because of whatever reasons. I happen to be in a system that works towards finding solutions when we can't discharge patients. So they're set up within town places where we can do that. Are we at Adventist doing that? The other questions I have is, how do we sit here in an ivory tower? How do we go to our local communities and start there? Because if I tell them I'm ethicist, I know exactly what happens. Ethicist, philosophy, oh dear. And I'm already put in one box, and I'm got a stamp of being very liberal. But what about creation, the community? That is God's image too. But we're still doing on the conference level diabetes to avoid taking medications, the same thing for other things. They're very specific, very individualized healthcare approaches. We do not address big social determinants of health. How do we change that in our denomination?
I think when I was here at Loma Linda, we had a group that spent a lot of time trying to think about what does wholeness mean, right? And we use the word a lot to make man whole. Wholeness is we're so passionate about, but what does it mean? And I think what some of us came down to is really about the disconnections and brokenness, the separation and disconnection from our aspirations and what we experience, our breakdowns with each other, the separations, and even the geography here. How are we living in relationship with people 3 miles north of here? And we even looked at our diabetes program here. You mentioned diabetes, and I think we have a really nice diabetes education. At the time, we had like 40 people in it. Well, there's thousands of people out there. How's that okay? How are we making an impact? I think it's starting to ask questions about scale that will dispossess us of being satisfied with what we're doing. And then we have to be humble, and we have to ask the question, how do we make more impact? And I think that's the pathway of learning, and that's the pathway of growth.
Thank you so much, Rick. Hopefully we'll have time toward the end of the session, but let's move now to Dr. J.C. Belliard, Claremont graduate PhD and an MPH here at Loma Linda. He is an application person. Is that appropriate to say, J.C.? Something I've particularly not been very good at, which is part of the reason I wanted to turn to him and ask for his help on this panel. His administrative duties include his position as Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Diversity and Director of the Institute for Community Partnerships at Loma Linda University, right here. When you open the blinds and look across the way, that's JC's job. So take us away, please.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate Rick's sharing from the heart. I think Rick always shares from the heart, and I really appreciate that. I wanted to start with positionality, like how did I get here? I was born exactly 64 miles west of here in the great city of Los Angeles, Nuestra Señora de Los Angeles, right? And you might think, oh, he was born at the White Memorial. Close. My mother actually worked at the White later on, but I was born at County General, right across the freeway from the White. And I always say that it was easier for me to end up here in Loma Linda because of where we moved to afterwards than if we would have stayed in East LA. My mother later was a housekeeper at the White Memorial. And when she was divorced from my father, I was a year old. And she decided to go back to her home country, Ecuador. And from Ecuador, we were there for about 4 years. She was a teacher at the academy, at the Adventist Academy. We came back to the States with one of the missionary families, the Rose family from Walla Walla. And she did her master's program at Walla Walla. So I went to Rogers Elementary School for the first few years of my K through 12 education. But what happened in Walla Walla really imprinted in me my future in public health. And I had no idea what public health was, and I didn't even know what public health was when I was in college. But I had a future in public health because my mother was the Bible worker for the Milton Freewater Spanish Church, right on the state line there. And this was, very typical, a small group of migrant workers and Spanish-speaking folks getting together and meeting at the basement of the church. And then pretty soon the group was bigger than the folks upstairs. So then we moved upstairs, and then the church became too small for that group. And then so they started the Walla Walla Spanish Church, which now is one of the largest churches in Walla Walla. That's Spanish speaking. Now there's others. But when my mother was doing Bible work, what I look back now and realize is she was more than a Bible worker. She was more of a community health worker. And I got used to going out every evening to visit people. And if we didn't, I would complain, are we going to go visit someone tonight? Because they always had the best food. And I grew up on Mexican food. Her main area of work was at the migrant camp right next to the college place there. And I can still, when I say that, I can still smell the food and the 1-bedroom apartments of, many family members living in these very cramped quarters. And just the life that they lived. But one thing that stands out is that I was about probably 7 years old then. And there was politically undocumented immigrants became a big no-no, right? And we kind of go up and down through this depending on who's in the office. And at that point, they went to the extent of offering a $200 reward if you would turn in an undocumented immigrant. So things got pretty hot. And at that time, my mom was giving Bible studies to this couple. I still remember them, Arturo and Noemi. And he was a motorcycle dude. And he had long hair, but they worked on the migrant camp. And she was pregnant. And Arturo gets deported. Somebody turns him in, collected their $200, and he gets deported. And now there's this pregnant wife without the husband to support her. And so they ended up coming, or she ended up coming and staying with us. And about 3 weeks later, Arturo shows up again. He was back. And had great stories. And I remember just listening to them. And eventually they had their little baby there at Walla Walla. But what I remember is one night in our apartment, we were we heard a knock at the door, and we look out through the window and there's a police officer at the door. And my mom just freaks out and she's like, okay, take Arturo and Noemi and the baby to the bathroom, turn the shower on, and just stay in there until I tell you to come out. Well, the police officer had seen a bicycle that was left on our front porch when they had gone on a walk that they had found on the side of the road. Somebody had left it there and they were trying to find, who owned it. So it was a stolen bike apparently, and the police officer was just asking where we found it. I said, oh, some friends found it, everything. But so nothing really happened, but it was one of those Corrie ten Boom moments in my childhood that really left in me this idea of like, these are people to be protected and loved, right? So there's a lot more that happened between 7 years and then coming here to Loma Linda. But I tell you that story because of the importance of proximity. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have in institutions is we have a lack of proximity. Brian Stevenson talks about that. I don't know if you've heard his TED Talk, but Brian Stevenson, a civil rights lawyer that does a lot of work in the South. And proximity is so important. And the reason I've been at Loma Linda University Health for almost 28 years now, this is before child labor laws, is not necessarily, I want to say because of our mission, right? I think it's an important mission, but it's not necessarily because of Loma Linda, it's because of my community. They've kept me here because 28 years of relationships is hard to walk away from, right? And I just wanted to share that because we need more of us and less of us and them. And I think that's why our campus needs to be a place where, people don't just come to get healthcare, but people come to work and people come to lead as well. And we need to see more of that. When I was at Claremont, my dissertation focused on the social responsibility of universities to communities. And that's why I do the work that I do now. But one thing that I learned in studying the history and the culture of Loma Linda is we have a very strong service culture. Right? We serve around the world. We serve our community. We start programs. We serve people. But you can serve your community without knowing your community. You can serve your community without respecting your community. And you can serve your community without having proximity. You might be there for a few hours, but then you go back. Right? And I think, speaking of religious arrogance, I think there's an important lesson that we can learn from some of the other religious practices. I've worked closely with our Catholic healthcare system across the freeway here, and one thing that the Catholic Church has done, or a lot of Catholic missionaries have done, is they have lived in the community. They haven't established compounds unless you go to the big one in the Vatican, right? But a lot of the frontline workers are in the community, in proximity. And over the years, we've had students that have insisted in living in San Bernardino. They come from other communities and they want to live in San Bernardino. And it's such a different experience for a medical student to live in the community that they later serve in the hospital than just knowing them as patients, right? So one of the things that we do at the Institute for Community Partnership is really try to move us from a culture of service to a culture of kinship. And Father Greg Boyle talks a lot about kinship, right? And in that proximity that you need to have kinship. And it's the relationship that Rick was talking about. Also, anytime you deal with culture, you have to look at your own culture first, right? And I always tell our students that we have a double barrier in our culture because we have Western culture that likes to fix things, right? Western culture that likes to extract. You mentioned the word extract. We didn't learn enough from the native cultures that were here of living in harmony. We could have learned a lot more from that. And this is running out. We wouldn't be in the problems and the situations that we are right now with climate if we would have learned not to just extract, but to live in harmony with. So that's one barrier. So Western culture, but then healthcare culture is also a fix-it culture. And the reason our young healers get burnt out is because they are unable to fix something that they can't really address. The number one frustration for a lot of physicians today are the social determinants of health, because they weren't trained to address housing, food insecurity, and all these social determinants. So what do I tell our students? The number one question I get from fourth years especially is, so what can we do about all these issues? It seems so overwhelming. And my answer is always, well, you don't have to do it on your own. You do it in partnership. There are people who address these issues, and you can work with them in doing that. I've always said that our mission is probably one of our biggest assets at Loma Linda, but our mission focuses on teaching and healing. But we need to get better at learning as well, because unless you learn, you can't teach. Unless you learn, you can't heal. And a lot of times we're trying to teach and heal a community that we don't even understand. So the learning is really important. Our motto at ICP at the Institute is listen, respect, and then act. A lot of times we get that backwards. We go in, we act, and then we debrief about it and learn about what went wrong, right? And so we treat community as a lab many times. Reciprocity is a really important word in service learning and community engagement, because it's not just what we're doing to the community, is how is the community transforming us? And reciprocity is important in healthcare as well, because like Rick had mentioned, you're not just healing a patient, the patient is also healing the healer. And getting students to understand that early on is so important. I just had my son's just started his third year here at the School of Medicine. And before he started doing rounds, I had him read, I'm always giving him books, Arthur Kleinman's Illness Narratives, on learning how to elicit narratives from his patients. Because I said, you have such a wealth of stories in your patients. If you can just find the time, and sometimes it doesn't even take that long, just to get little bits and pieces from those patients. And what that does is it brings value to that healing process. And the healing is both for the healer and for the patient. I know a lot has been said about the tension in our Seventh-day Adventist culture as well. The tension between this world is not my home, right? And this is my Father's world. What we have here, and I love this fourth floor conference room because we get to see our community. What we have right now is a huge crisis of warehouse expansion. And as healthcare systems, we're not used to dealing with those things. That's not healthcare. But let me tell you, it is healthcare, because those warehouses are attracting a lot of diesel trucks. And those diesel trucks are causing a lot more incidents of asthma and respiratory problems in our community. So the question to our leadership is, like, what are we going to do about the warehouses? You know, UCR, Pitzer, some of the other U of R, University of Redlands, just wrote a large report on the impact on health of warehouses. I was on a flight coming in from Denver once, and this gentleman sitting next to me was coming from New Jersey. And he was here because he was moving his warehouses from New Jersey. He's like, we ran out of space out there, but you guys have so much cheap dirt, is what he called it. And so I have to think about, we have to expand that role of healthcare to be a voice for the community as well. Hospitals competing for market share. We hear that all the time, right? The good news is that at the community benefit level, I feel like the community benefit folks work better together than a lot of the rest of the folks at the hospital level, right? Because we're in the community right now. The city of San Bernardino is putting together a recuperative care center, which is a win-win-win for all of us. So the IHP, the Inland Empire Health Plan, is part of that. Both Dignity Hospitals, St. Bernardine's and Community Hospital, Loma Linda, we're all very interested in having a place where our discharges from the ED that have minor medical needs can go and not just back out on the street. That's really the sense of wholeness. And I appreciate the question about wholeness, not just being individual, but community. So one of my late colleagues, Sam Surratt, who was a professor at the School of Public Health, died tragically about, I think it's been like 6 or 7 years ago now. He would also always say, there is no whole person without whole communities, right? We cannot address individuals without addressing what caused that individual to get sick in the first place. One of the examples I wanted to share with you of something that we've been doing, and it's happening across the state and across the country, is community health workers. And for those of you who know me, I sound like a broken record, but I read a book once called Essentialism. I don't know if you've seen it, but I highly recommend it. And it made me an essentialist. And since then, I've been so focused on community health workers, and that's all I talk about, it seems like. But community health workers are an answer to social determinants. And they're one of these multi-solving approaches as well, because what you're doing with community health workers, and we have 8 in our system right now, is you're giving people jobs, people that didn't maybe have a stable job before. You're giving them benefits. These are full-time positions as well. And then they're able to help us deal with patients that we have no idea how to deal with. We have a CalVIP grant right now that is supporting 4 VIP community health workers that are violence intervention program specialists. And I was shadowing one of our VIPs last week, and this is what the day looked like. So the first patient, she was coming back from a meeting with our community partners, Hope Culture and Young Visionaries that deal with Black and Latino gangs in San Bernardino. So they do shoot reviews. So when there's a shootout somewhere, they do reviews, they look at who the victims were. And then when the patient is discharged from the hospital, if they agree, they enroll them into a program of violence intervention, so they can break that cycle of violence. And Dr. Sigrid Burris is the PI and has been instrumental in this. And as a trauma surgeon, she got tired of seeing the same patients coming back a year later with the same gunshot wounds that she had just patched up a year before. And she said, how can we move upstream and really start addressing this at a systems level? So that's what we do. We work with, here's a public health guy working with a trauma surgeon and hiring these VIPs. First of all, to be able to hire violence prevention CHW is not so easy. I found out HR is not used to, we have this thing called background checks. And their background checks were the reason we recruited them, right? Exactly the stuff that works against them in an HR interview is exactly what we needed. So we had to get our legal involved to, and fortunately, legal understood, and we got them hired. But one of our VIPs was in prison for 22 years, and he says this openly. He was in prison for 22 years, just came out. So anyway, I was following one of the CHWs. She was coming from a meeting and was going to meet a patient that was just being discharged. And he was being discharged to the Loma Linda Inn, where we had a voucher for 7 days. He didn't have a place to go back to. So I said, well, I'll meet you at the inn. I'll pick him up at the hospital. So I picked him up. We walked to the Loma Linda Inn. She gave him not just the vouchers to stay at the inn, but also some bus vouchers so he could get to work that night, because he didn't want to miss work that night at one of the warehouses. So she was helping him with that. From there, we drove to North San Bernardino, where she was meeting a young man who was in our tattoo removal clinic. He's been getting his gang-related tattoos removed. And he just got out of prison 2 weeks ago. Had spent his entire adult life in prison and didn't know, like she said, he doesn't have any life skills. And he's trying to buy a truck so he can get a job in construction. And there's a guy trying to sell him a truck, but this dude doesn't know anything about cars or mechanics. So she's like, Dr. B, do you have a car scanner? And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. And she's like, oh, never work. Don't worry about it. AutoZone will have one. So we pull up, and this guy who was trying to sell him an old Ford F-150 didn't have a pink slip. He said, I'll just copy my license, my driver's license, and you can take it to the DMV and they'll give you a new one. And then she's like, wait a minute, you think this dude here is going to go to the DMV with all his tats and a copy of your license? They're going to think you stole the car. And then anyway, there's all kinds of things. And this young man was like a child. He didn't know how to negotiate this. And she was doing this for him and helping him through it. And then after that, we had a gunshot wound victim in the ER who was very irate. Had to be strapped down, had been shot. And the one thing he said is like, don't you guys have any food here? He had been homeless for months. And we explained, like, you can't have any food because you might need surgery. It's like, well, how about some entertainment or something? He was pretty high. And he's like, I've been wanting to watch Black Panther. And Nicole, our VAP, says, well, I don't have Black Panther on my phone, but I have Woman King. Would you like to watch that? He's like, sure. This guy, for the next hour and a half, she held the phone for him there. And they watched Woman King together. And while this young man is the calmest he had been, the nurses said, what did you do to him? It's like, Woman King, right here on the phone. While he was watching the movie, he gave us his whole history. He told us that his dad was a LAPD chief, gave us the phone number of his family so we could reach out to him. I mean, there's so much that happened just because of this time spent. Time is the medicine, is what our CHW say. So I just wanted to share that community health workers are us, but they're them. Right? They're them here as part of our clinical teams now. And they're bridging this gap. And now there's a lot of challenges that go with integrating community health workers in our system. But I have hope that it's a new way of doing medicine. And it's a new way of healing our patients. And I wanted to end with a Father Greg Boyle quote, my favorite. And he says, no daylight to separate us. And I love that. No daylight to separate. That's how close we are. Only kinship, inching ourselves closer to creating community of kinship, such that God might recognize it. Soon we imagine with God this circle of compassion. Then we imagine no one standing outside of that circle, moving ourselves closer to the margins so that the margins themselves will be erased. We stand there with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And then finally, what we seek, says Father Boyle, is a compassion that stands in awe of what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment of how they carry it. And I think our community health workers model that for us. And talk about cultural humility. They teach that to us. So that's what I wanted to share today.
Thank you so much, JC. I really appreciate it. I'll use my prerogative as the convener to ask a quick follow-up question as others of you prepare your own questions. My question to Saul and Yishen earlier was a bit of a setup for this time. And I'll ask a question related. So I asked them, it's risky to partner with others that we don't know, the other, right? In your experience, have you ever thought to yourself in debrief or afterwards, oops, that didn't go so well? And so one of the questions I have is, with whom do we partner and how? And have you ever found yourself saying, oh, that didn't go so well?
Yeah, so starting with your comment about it's risky to partner, it's risky to have relationships, period. You know, when you get married, you're taking a big risk. When you have children, you're taking a big risk. But some of the most valuable things in our lives probably carry the biggest risk with them. So yes, I think there's a huge risk in partnering. I'd like to think of a word we use in research. I know this seems like way off, but triangulation. The more partners you have, the more those few that might be an oops don't matter as much, but you also learn from those partnerships. Even if there are some partnerships that maybe didn't align mission-wise, or there were hidden agendas, I think you have enough partnerships out there that you really find that a majority of the partnerships are of great value, and the others you learn from.
Thank you. Other questions, thoughts, comments?
Thank you. Appreciate the comments. And I do want to affirm your perspective on kinship versus service. A lot of communities get frustrated with us because we've come in and tried to change them all. I would love your comments from both of you on scale. When I think back on projects that spun for years and it was very difficult to see what they accomplished, a lot of them seem like we went for the big win versus an incremental approach. I'm just going back on my memory, but I'd love you to talk about, because it takes a certain level of patience to go incrementally, because we all want the big home run swing for the fence. But I'd love you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think scale is really important. It's around impact and it's about effectiveness. And so, I think one of the things I've seen in innovation is really the idea of lean startup, moving away from business planning. This is kind of the strategist in me talking. And, we used to try to dream what would happen over 5 years in huge amounts of detail, which was basically a waste of time because nothing ever works that way. And so lean startup taught us something about learning. And, Otto Scharmer, who has really influenced a lot of my thinking from MIT, talks about learning from the future as it emerges. And, you go deep into purpose in your heart, and you move forward with an open mind, open heart, and open will. And then you start prototyping and learning from the future. That's easy to say, it's hard to do, because our patterns of self-judgment are hypercritical. And instead of learning, we protect ourselves around that. And so what I see, though, is what we lack is the organizational capacity or capability. We need to learn it, of being able to rapidly iterate both in terms of quality and in terms of scale. And I think what happens is we kind of lock in to what's successful, then we're having the risk conversation. Oh, can we really step out of that? And we minimize what that potential impact has. But I think setting that vision on scale and then realizing that everything we do becomes an iteration on that creates a hyper-focused learning process that can begin probably progressing there as fast as anything.
I think it's a great question and one that I get a lot. I'm not as focused on scale, to be honest. I'm focused on this community right here, and that's where the essentialist in me comes in again. I feel like what we've learned with the San Bernardino community and the Inland Empire, it has been able to reach scale just by sharing with other systems, and then them adapting and applying it to their communities. But to me, when I know, families who are now, who started in maybe some of our tutoring programs, their kids started in tutoring, and now the kids are in college and have graduated, to me, that's very satisfying. Also, our pipeline programs, we have 70 students every summer here on campus. And we've had discussions about how do we scale this up? How do we impact the thousands that are out there? I think if we do a good job with these students that we have that have been entrusted to us, they will replicate that, the ripple effect, because they're going to influence their siblings and their friends and others. So I guess I don't lose a lot of sleep over scale. I do lose sleep about the sense of urgency that there are more kids out here that we need to reach, and how do we do that, and how do we do it well?
Other questions?
Thank you so much. I have actually more of a procedural question about, you talked about just the obstacle of getting through HR. So how can you talk about the process of how you recruit the individuals to be these community health workers, and then just kind of like what are some of the, besides that example you gave, or have there been other kind of bumps in the road along the way in just trying to get community health workers into the role they need to be to do their job?
I thought you were going to ask, how do you get through the obstacles of just hiring in general? But yeah, this is next level. So recruitment first. It depends on the program. We have a wealth of resources in just our Adventist churches in the area. There are so many immigrant families who are, cleaning houses, raising other people's children, cooking for people who are, Dorcas leaders in their church, or who are PTO leaders at the school, and they're already doing community health worker work. They just don't know what it is. We also partner and have partnered with El Sol, a neighborhood education center that is a community-based organization that's been doing this for 20 years. So they're the experts when it comes to community health workers. So they refer CHWs to us at promotores. For the VIP, we have partners that work in this space, and they've sent us 2 of our 4. One of our 4 was already somebody that we had hired through another partner, COPE, Congregations Organized for Prophetic Engagement, CBO, that we did a lot around the vaccines during COVID, mostly in African American churches. And then our 4th VIP was brought in from our school-based community health workers that was doing really great work, but she had grown up in a family where both parents were incarcerated. Her current husband just got out of prison, and she grew up in kind of that gang life. So I think it's just that the network of relationships that we have, and then, one person knows another, and then word of mouth. So that's the recruitment side. The actual hiring part, the biggest thing is orienting people to like even clocking out. When we first got into this, we noticed that our community health workers were using up all their PTO. Like as soon as they acquired it, they would just use it. And we started, talking about, well, would you like to take a vacation someday and like maybe have it be a week or two? And they're like, where would we go with, a week of vacation? So a lot of that is very new to a lot of them, but yeah, even, those, what people call the soft skills, in working in a system where maybe they weren't used to that. I don't know if that answered all. What other question you had? Okay. Yeah.
Final question.
So where we are there, they have a pathways hub. I don't know whether that's something similar to you, but an agreement with the insurers. So actually a community health worker opens a pathway, closes a pathway, then they get reimbursed through the insurers. So you can recover a significant amount of the costs of the community health worker through that hub. But I just wanted to encourage us as well to think about it. I was sitting with the city of Xenia, with the mayor, with the police chief, the fire chief, and the city manager. And they basically said to me, look, we could identify 100 people to you who consume most of our time. And if we could work out how to manage those people, then we would have benefit. And you would also have the benefit because they're the ones who are always turning up in your ER and everywhere else. And so I want us to encourage when we're looking at community health workers, because I'm looking at doing a pilot where I want to actually sponsor 2 community health workers for the city who's actually going to be dealing with that outside of my boundaries, but actually then I get the benefit. And I want to see if I get the benefit by then seeing less of that person in my ER. And I think that, again, the community health workers is a huge thing in the future, but I wanted to encourage us to think of the role that we could play in partnership by actually supporting people to actually have community health workers, which we get the downstream benefit from.
We have a contract with a county where we're the prime, and then we subcontract with partners for Medi-Cal enrollment. And that's all done through navigators. And they do it at churches, at swap meets, at grocery stores. One thing so California just approved reimbursement for community health workers last July, and things are still trying to get worked out. I think the challenge with reimbursement is now we're hearing language around productivity for CHWs. And because we're just hiring some new ones for a new department, and they were saying, well, the community time is non-productive time. The time that they're actually with the patients are, that's productive time because they get reimbursed for that. So I think it's also, that's where I say the community health workers are helping us change the way we think and changing our system. And if they don't, and if they just get appropriated into a healthcare system that's already broken, then we failed. And I think that it's a really critical time to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you very much, JC. Appreciate it. We have about, on the schedule, 30 more minutes. I'm going to take maybe 15 of that, and then we'll open for lingering questions, and that'll give us some nice break time. I'd like to share a few things, if I can pull up my screen. It'll be summary in some ways, but hopefully prompt a few lingering questions for us. What does solidarity mean? Thank you, Yishin, for offering that definition for us earlier. The title of this session was Engaging in Solidarity through an Altruistic Lens. Altruism, particularly in healthcare, facing the needs of those we serve over our own needs. And I think in both of your talks, you've illustrated that it's difficult in corporate settings to have altruism truly live out. And I understand that difficulty, but I think it's important for us to remember that we are in an altruistic venture as we historically understand the reason for work in healthcare. There are things that stand in the way, and sectarianism in religion is one of them. And I think that's particularly problematic for Seventh-day Adventism. As you probably know, I work for a Catholic healthcare corporation, Providence St. Joseph Health. And it's not as if sectarianism or othering is unique to Adventism. It's prevalent. But how do we adjust that? And then the American corporate structure and culture. Corporations, by their nature, have to be self-serving. That is what an American corporation is. And our society has asked these two social institutions, healthcare and corporations, to take care of our public. So how do we have a self-serving corporate structure combined with an altruistic healthcare culture, working together in the same building, if you will, facility, community, in ways that make sense? And it's a quandary, but there are ways to adjust for it. Some examples, the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, among their hidden statements, guidelines, and documents that are not so hidden, actually, there's one entitled How Seventh-day Adventists View Roman Catholics. It's one of my favorite statements, as you might imagine. We work in concert with all agencies and bodies that seek to relieve human suffering. We recognize some positive changes in recent Catholicism. Wow, wouldn't it be nice to hear an Adventist evangelist say something like that? Sorry, I just had to take that moment of an aside there. We recognize positive changes and stress the conviction that many Roman Catholics are our brothers and sisters in Christ.
Why the many?
Pardon me?
Why the many?
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Thank you for saying so. I was being very careful. Some examples of how to partner with others. I was really hopeful that my colleague Jennifer Donatov would be able to come from west of here to share with us her wisdom of Catholicism and the discernment methods. Dennis, you've worked, Dr. DeLeon, he's worked in Catholic healthcare systems. Discernment is a type of thing. It's a thing for Catholics to figure out if the proposed idea is actually a good idea. So what are the steps you have to go through to figure out if we should partner with this or that entity in the community? And there's a very elaborate process. Principles of cooperation, something I've had to become very knowledgeable of. Formal and material, proximate and distant. Go ahead and Google it. It's some fascinating, it's 2,000 years of thought about how to engage in partners with whom we disagree. It's fascinating as an Adventist to engage in figuring out whether or not we should partner with this or that group. Because note in the parentheses, we always hear about principles of cooperation. No one likes to say the rest of the formal phrase, with evil, right? I'm considering partnering with Alex. What are the principles of cooperation with evil that I need to be concerned about? See, you're the other. How do I engage the other and do it in a way that's appropriate to my own tradition? Adventism could learn some good things by learning from these things. And then the well-known document, Ethical and Religious Directives. These are not guidelines. These are not suggestions. The title is accurate. It's a directive. However, as you probably well know, even being an Adventist, when the General Conference president speaks, doesn't mean you're going to do it. The same is true in every religion. Just because the directives say what they do doesn't mean Catholic hospitals can just jump in line and do what the bishops say. There are difficulties. The document needs interpretation. One of the best examples I ever ran into was when I was working with Centura Health, and we might spend some time thinking about Centura Health and its relevance to this conversation, given the fact that it has now dissolved. Speaking of partnerships, in Centura Health, they had this thing called values in action, and I just absolutely loved it. No matter the place, here was the rule in the corporation at the time when I was here consulting with Centura Health. No matter the conversation, if somebody at the table felt like the direction the committee was going was inconsistent with the values and the mission of the company, they had a right to say, hey, hold up. I call a pause. I call a values in action pause, and we need to talk now, right now, about whether or not this really fits. Now, I don't know, Mark Stoddard, because you're a Centura person, how often it was used. I just have always loved the idea. And imagine a corporate leader who empowers the people at the table to say, okay, you interrupt me anytime you think I'm talking in ways that are inconsistent with who we are. Think about that. That's a powerful tool for everybody at that table and a good way to lead people. Some other examples. Advent Health has a document. I wrote an article one time for the Catholic Health Association's ethics journals about Adventist Catholic joint operating agreements. And one of the things that I sought and got from Advent Health at the time was this special document that they had for new acquisitions, mission and management at an Advent Health facility. Purpose of the document is to identify, describe, and provide rationale for essential principles. I want you to note, however, what's going on here. This is not partnering with entities in the community to have a combined effort to go somewhere. This is an acquisition. This is based on corporate growth and letting those that we consume into our own know who we are so that they can behave appropriately. Now, it's a good document. It's a very good document. And I don't mean it to be a criticism, because it's just how we do our thing. Bond markets, bond ratings, margins. This is how American corporations do healthcare. And we're doing the best we can at it. How do we partner in more meaningful ways? Sacred trust. This is my final slide. In the process of doing this article I just referred to, St. Joseph Health, which is now part of Providence St. Joseph Health, and Adventist Health. It's easy to get confused about all of the different Adventist health corporations. Advent Health, Adventist Health. What's the one on the East Coast? Adventist Health Care. At the time, Adventist Health, based in Roseville, was trying to enter into a joint operating agreement with St. Joseph Health from the company that I was involved in. It had only involved maybe 10 hospitals, 5 on each side or something of that sort. And in order to operate this way, they had to get the approval of the California Attorney General. And he said no. Why? Because in his evaluation, it would not further the benefits of the communities we served. Rick, when you and I were talking about this panel, you noted that your sense of the community in the city where your hospital was kind of tired of the competition. And am I correct that there was a Catholic hospital and an Adventist hospital? And so we're asking the public who doesn't know a whit about the background between Catholics and Adventists to help to understand why these two entities are competing the way they are for market share. So it's difficult. And the Attorney General, who is now, I don't know what the office is at the federal government level, but he's now Biden's chief healthcare person. Yeah. So some thoughts from me. We're close to time, but I also want to just allow any final thoughts and follow-up questions. Thanks for enjoying this time together. I really appreciate it. There's a lot more that can be said. I want to thank you both. And my gosh, I didn't realize you're coming from Massachusetts. But thank you for coming. And JC, he and I quickly bonded as Raiders fans years ago. But right, yeah, go figure. But the story that you shared about your childhood with your mom, last night we sat across the way and talked about the book House on Fire, and part of my own sense of stories being far more powerful than any proposition of truth somewhere. What a powerful way to introduce yourself. Thank you for doing that. Yes, Dennis.
Mark, thank you. Thank all of you up there for tremendous contribution today. Thank you, Mark.
So my thought or question was, as we talk about partnerships in this sacred sense, where we're both parties or all parties, community health, public health, acute care, medicine, which is what we're really good at in this setting. As those partnerships are being contemplated, right, we assess how we might be changed by our soon-to-be partners. You mentioned learning from the community health workers and the incorporating that into what our DNA here. But at the same time, we offer something to our partner, right? We bring something and it's transactional, but there is a give and take. I'm wondering, from any of the three of you, what do you see as what we, with our acute care DNA, high margins, propensity for Western medicine with intervention at high cost, individualistic, not really community, all those things I worry about those things because I think we look for partners to correct for some of those, but what do we bring positively when we partner with others? That's uniquely our gift.
I mean, I can take a stab at it. I'll tell you what the community's told us. They're tired of hearing about a blue zone up on the hill. They want the blue zone in their community as well. So I think that what they learned by being part of us is just another. I think the Adventist culture has a richness in valuing education. And I think that's something that we have to offer. I think there's also the value of lifestyle and prevention. And I think it's a wonderful gift to a community that is plagued by chronic illness. But before we get to that, we have to address the environmental aspects of their community. But they're very interested in learning about that.
So in my experience, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 acquisitions of secular hospitals into Adventist Health. My very first CEO job was a district hospital that we took over. And, what I would say is what we brought was a sense of purpose and mission. Because the level of cynicism out there, the fact that you're struggling for survival, the idea that why am I coming to work? Nobody wants to work here. It's a small town or we're a failing hospital. But when they were invited into a sense of purpose, the conventional wisdom, especially in rural California, was you avoid taking care of poor people. That was what we were all taught. Mm-hmm. You make it hard for Medi-Cal patients to find your hospital, and you do well. We called it payer mix. You manage the payer mix. Well, that was a euphemism for avoiding caring for poor people. And our hospital struggled. I remember in 2003, we lost more money than all the hospitals in Adventist Health combined. And what transformed our system in the Central Valley was a lot of self-reflection. Like, why did God put us here? If he didn't want us to take care of poor people, why are we here? Yeah. And all of a sudden we said, well, we're here for a reason. It's a God-ordained reason we're here. There's no accident. We're going to care for poor people. In fact, we're going to make it critical and centered our business. And in a year and a half, that group of hospitals was the most profitable in the system. Conventional wisdom has failed us. And I think when we tap deeply into mission and we live out mission with gusto, with following the way God, has in front of us and learning from that, I think it makes a difference. So what was it like to be a district hospital employee who became part of this? All of a sudden, you're caring for your neighbors in a new way, so there's passion around that. The last one I did was the one I just did most recently in Marysville, Yuba City. For those of you that don't know, Yuba City is about 30% Punjabi population. A very strong Sikh community that's developed there for a long time. So there's thousands of Sikhs. It's probably the most prevalent religious group in that community. And it was a very secular hospital. And when the board made the decision to affiliate with Adventist Health, the board chairman was extremely concerned about about the Christianity, that it was going to be offensive to that community. And, she and I had a lot of very tense discussions around mission and how we use the word. But when she kind of left the scene, we would start doing a reflection every morning. And Francisco Cross and I decided one day, let's just throw this open to our entire leadership team, of which, 30% were Sikh. And what we found was we told people, there's no formula for prayer. This is about you expressing deeply inside your spirituality and sharing it with others. I'll tell you, I grew exponentially, spiritually, from what I experienced. Mm-hmm. There were people who were secular, who for the first time in their life came into connection with something deeply spiritual inside of them. And through that found a collective sense of purpose and meaning in their work that never existed before. So there's a value proposition there, but it's not what we would have thought going in. There was a value proposition for us because we found that every human being carries with them the divine spark of God put in them. And that the expression of that becomes a spirituality that can transform our organization in ways we would have never designed or dreamed. And to me, that was my experience of solidarity. And so that's the value that I see. Because when we get deeply to purpose and why we exist and what we're in the world to accomplish, that resonates incredibly. It passes over sectarian lines. It passes over cultural lines, because we are reconnecting the human race as children of God. And that's compelling.
Thank you, Rick. And JC, I would also add, not long after I went back to Anchorage working for Providence St. Joseph, I was sitting watching TV with my family, and my boss appeared on the TV. And she was talking about whole person care. At Providence, we deliver whole person care. And I said, hold up here. No. That's ours. Turns out it's not just ours, but I do think it's a huge value. But if we can do it, and he's gone now, but if we can do it with humility rather than arrogance, that makes, I think, the distinct value difference. And we've got another question here, and that'll be the final question.
Rick, thank you for preaching to us and sharing your ethical convictions. Coming from an MBA, I just think that that's huge. My general comment is to thank the conveners of this whole 3 days, because I don't think we should take it for granted, because it hasn't always been that way. I mean, my colleague, Jerry Winslow, who may not be here, I mean, he helped get this going, you know, for the Adventist health systems, what is it, 5 now, to come together. And as I like to put it, play catch up with our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters who have, as Mark, he could tell us much more, have been doing it for hundreds of years. And so the idea of solidarity comes through to me, and the value of our coming together and deeply sharing about what you were just underscoring, Rick, the purpose for our being here to begin with. And it's through serious heartfelt or originated conversation that we have the possibility of getting beyond our sectarianism and our corporatism and all of these things that keep us from doing what we're really called by God to be about. And so I just applaud the fact that we do have these sort of meetings annually, that we have them among the different Adventist healthcare systems. We openly acknowledge our need to continue to work with our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. We have MDs and PhDs and MBAs all coming together and sharing on a common enterprise. And it helps us here at Loma Linda, because for too long we have been this holy hill, and the others down there have wondered about us, and we haven't done much to bridge the gap. And JC, your personal stories of what you and others have done and how we are breaking down the mammoth concrete walls of the fine medical center and getting out there. We can't underscore the importance of our being together and talking, and together moving out in our more mature ways of serving. Thank you.
Once again, thank you one and all for your time, and hope you have a good day.